Hello and welcome to another episode of the Way We Grow podcast, a production of the Craft Growers Network. I'm your host, Nick Wolf, and today our guest is Tad Hussy of KiS Organics. He is also the host of the Cannabis, Cultivation, and Science podcast. Welcome to the show, Tad. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. I think we've been talking about doing some sort of show with you on between the co-founder Gabby and myself and you, and just trying to figure out what that would look like. And I figure, I just wanted to talk to you and find out more about your history and your story and sort of what led you to where you are today within the cannabis community and the gardening and cultivation community as a whole. So why don't you tell me a little bit about your past? Like, where did gardening start for you? I feel like I know a little bit about your past just from listening to your own podcast, but tell us like sort of where that started with you and then how it transitioned into cannabis.
Yeah, I want to say I literally met Gabby decades ago. We've both been in around this industry for quite a long time, and I know we discussed maybe having a organics, not versus, but discussion between organics and mineral salts conversation at some point. And I thought that would be kind of a fun thing to do. But in terms of my background, I grew up with my parents owning a nursery and landscape business. They had a 7-acre property that they had a full-scale nursery on. And so I grew up around plants pretty much my entire life. Growing up like that, it was one of those things where I didn't really, I kind of rebelled against it and decided to go in a different direction. So did the high school thing, college, and I had worked like on maintenance crews and construction and planted plants and done all of that stuff. It's extremely hard work doing it for a living, and I have a lot of respect for people that do. So after college and going into grad school, I got degrees in things totally unrelated to the horticulture and science, cannabis and things like that. But I came back from grad school looking for work, and I ended up going to work for my parents again. Actually, my father had founded a compost tea brewing business, and this was back in I want to say 1999, 2000, so quite a while ago now. And he was one of the very first soil food web advisors with Dr. Ingham. Spent a lot of money on testing and learning about how we can brew beneficial microbes from compost and apply them to our gardens. So I got a pretty early course into the soil food web, and that was sort of where my journey started. Now, fast forward a little bit to 2010, right around there, 2011. And my parents, who had sold their nursery, were getting the property back that they owned their nursery on. And it was this beautiful 7 acres along a salmon-bearing stream. And this was, victory gardens were becoming a thing. Vegetable gardening was becoming more popular. And it was something that I was really passionate about at the time. I had taken out my front lawn and put in a whole vegetable garden up there, trying to find creative ways to grow food in an urban and suburban environment. And so we took this 7-acre property and we put in a feed store, because there was no feed store in Redmond, Washington at the time. Okay. This is, Microsoft area, Nintendo, all of that. Yeah. So we put in a feed store, we put in a unique edible plant nursery. So we had edibles that you couldn't find anywhere else that did really well in our area. And then we had, 40-foot production greenhouse.
Just to interrupt. What were some of those edible plants that were like really unique that you were like, man, you couldn't find these anywhere else, but we had them?
Oh boy, that's a great question. It was quite a while ago now. We had things like hardy kiwis that do quite well in our area. It's a vine that produces a miniature kiwi, for example, that you wouldn't be able to find at a lot of places. If your people are interested in unique edibles, go to check out One Green World. They're a nursery out of Oregon, and that's where we got a lot of our stock was from their wholesale side.
Oh, cool.
But even things like out here, you don't see a lot of mulberries or just a variety of different unique nuts and plants that you just don't see in traditional nurseries in production. So it was a nice opportunity for people to come get different types of fruit trees and herbs and things that they wouldn't find elsewhere.
That's
We also
awesome.
had an outdoor preschool on the property, which is really cool because we had pigs and ducks and goats and chickens, and kids were able to go in, pretty freely to get to see all these animals. The chicken pen was open all the time, and then we'd have tours and things that were all free. And so it was a really, really cool property. And then along with all of that, we were also doing KiS Organics, which is the business we have now. So we were making soils, and I had gotten into growing myself because when we started this compost tea business, I went online and actually ended up on icmag.com in the organic soil section. That's where like Clackamas Coot, Jeremy from Build a Soil, a lot of us were just happened to be in that forum at a certain period of time on the internet. And in there, I realized that the information around aerated compost teas was just really wrong. And as someone who is passionate about science and had learned a lot about it, I started posting in there, and then I started learning about soils and soil science and things like that. And so it kind of evolved from there. And the soil side and the nutrients. One of the things I also realized when I wanted to mix my own soils was I couldn't get 3 pounds or 5 pounds of kelp meal or soft rock phosphate or bone meal or whatever organic a nutrient or amendment I wanted. You could go down and buy a 50-pound bag if you were lucky at the local feed store or the local garden center. But so we started offering those things online for folks. I think we were actually one of the first companies to do that. There's definitely a lot of companies that do it now, but yeah, that was kind of the beginning of my journey and KiS Organics. And since then, I've grown quite a bit of cannabis as well as vegetable gardening, and in just before COVID. So what was that, 2018 now, I think? I'm trying to remember. Right around the beginning of COVID, we actually, 2020. Okay. So around 2019, then we actually shut down our farm and ended up selling the property to be made into a natural park because we had some issues with the county with zoning that changed on the property. So unfortunately we had to close that property down, and then we went full into KiS Organics. So the focus became fully on the soils and nutrients on the organic side for making living soils and soil testing and doing all of that. So that's where I'm at right now in the journey. It's been a lot of fun.
Very cool. Do you mind me asking, what was your undergraduate and your graduate degrees?
Yeah, so my undergrad was from the University of Washington in cultural anthropology with a teaching minor in English. And then I was working at the time with kids quite a bit and decided to go back to school to get my master's degree in Australia, in Sydney, Australia at Macquarie Uni in special education.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, it was great. I came back with a special ed degree that I couldn't use in the United States necessarily. I would have had to go back to school some more, and I was getting pretty burnt out at that point. And special ed is it's a tough field in general. But what I will say, the one thing that it taught me going to grad school was really how to read a journal article, read a scientific paper, and draw accurate and realistic conclusions for what that information is actually telling me.
For sure.
So I found that more useful than anything. And since then, I've gone back to school and taken some classes in botany and other aspects of soil science to really just try and improve my knowledge. But as someone who's been around plants my whole life, it's kind of something that I've just been exposed to since I was a kid.
For sure. My partner is going actually for a cultural anthropology degree as well. And so that's really fascinating because, some of the stuff that they've taught me about anthropology in general, it applies so well to sort of the approach to trying to understand like the community surrounding cannabis, as well as, there are very, I sometimes hear it referred to as like, especially with organic practices, there's like the practice of organics and then the religion of organics. And then, similarly in salts, right, there's the practice of using salts for fertility. And then there's some people that are almost like religious about it as well. But having that sort of that spread is really interesting. And I never really looked at it through the lens that I look through it now, without having some of that information sort of leached over onto me as I hear them talk about their studies. So that's really fascinating. And sometimes it makes me think that when I've listened to your podcast before, I really clicked with a lot of the approach that you took in terms of how you were trying to parse out the information of each professional that you would bring on to talk about their sort of field of expertise. And so I'm kind of like, oh, I think I understand that a little bit more now, as to the approach to some of that being sort of an anthropological approach. So it makes a lot of sense to me. So when you first started growing cannabis, because it seems as though you sort of seamlessly transitioned from just being focused on these unique vegetables and fruits, trees and whatnot, and having that be something that was sort of a centerpiece that the business would like sort of showcase, and then the compost tea brewing and sort of the very specifics about that, and seeing how people were applying it to cannabis through Icy Mag. What was your first experience growing cannabis like? Was it something that you did at a much younger age that you didn't then revisit until you had all of this knowledge, or did you go into it full bore with all the knowledge that you had at the time and sort of hit the ground running?
Yeah, I was a real straight edge kind of kid.
Okay.
I followed all the rules. I was certainly not a cannabis user growing up. In fact, I didn't try cannabis until I was in my 20s.
For sure.
Mid to late 20s when I think about it. And a part of that is my own anxiety around, health and putting things into my body, and I don't know how I'm going to react to them, and that's just my own personal anxieties. But I will say, I got into it because I saw this misinformation around it, and then I got curious, and I wanted to know what it'd be like to grow this plant that we don't know much about. And at the time, you have to put yourself back. It was medical here in Washington State. It was still very much illegal to grow. Even with a medical license, you were still kind of in a gray area there, and it wasn't totally safe. You certainly couldn't sell it or do anything like that. Sure. So connecting with a community of growers was a little bit, I guess you could say it was a little sketchier in that regard. But I met some amazing people through Icy Mag. I met some amazing people locally who helped me get started, because I don't know your background to know this, but like when I was looking to learn about growing cannabis specifically, and I had a bunch of background growing other plants, but cannabis specifically, you would walk into a grow store, and the grow store was usually like, at least around where I was, it was kind of dingy. It was like the main one was like down an alley. You kind of would park around the corner because you felt like it was probably being watched by cops, and kind of walk in, and there were no plants growing in this grow store. It was just row after row of bottles. Mm-hmm. And no one looked very happy in the store, to be honest. It was kind of a depressing environment. All the bottles had like caricatures of like Amazonian women in bikinis, or like these giant plants like Seymour from Little Shop of Horrors. Yeah. And that was what they had. And it was so different than my background, coming from having a parents who owned essentially a garden center, where all you have on the front is maybe a picture of a little flower and the MPK and the ingredients list on the back.
Sure.
Everything in cannabis at the time was proprietary. It was really confusing. And I was like, well, do I need all this to grow a plant? What do I actually need to grow a cannabis plant? Because I honestly had no idea. I'd never grown it. And so I decided not to go that route. I mean, I got the equipment that I needed, but then I wanted to try growing in soil, or what we now call living soil. And so I threw a bunch of ingredients, peat moss, pumice, high quality worm castings, and a bunch of different organic amendments on a tarp, mixed it all together. And actually, while I was mixing that, this guy, Jaya Palmer, and his girlfriend Hillary at the time came by the house, because we were running the compost tea business out of my parents' garage at the time. They came by to pick up some compost tea supplies, because we were one of the few people that was doing that at the time. And I sent Jaya home with some of our soil that I was just mixing there. I was like, oh, I don't know, try this out, because I could tell he was growing.
Sure.
And he came back to me a few months later, and was like, "Oh my gosh, this is great." And so he was actually the one that really inspired me to start looking into this more and growing more. So he started doing experiments. He was in 7-gallon pots in his basement, and he started he was comparing it with his current method, which was like a liquid organic bottled nutrient line. And so he started with just water. And so we just watered the plant, and the results were better than what he was getting using these organic nutrient lines.
Wow.
And it was a lot easier. And then we started looking at, okay, well, if we don't have to take the soil out of the garage, or out of his basement, and bring in new soil every cycle, that cuts down on a lot of like activity in front of the house. Doing that at 3:00 in the morning isn't fun. No. So he started experimenting with reusing the soil. And then it was like, if all the pots are touching each other and they start growing together, he sees the roots are growing through the pots, the fabric pots together. He's like, well, what if I just put them all in one giant bed? And I'm not to say that he or I invented this. Other people were doing this concurrently at the same time. This was just the journey of like my little group of growers.
But it was still like a self-discovery journey. Like you weren't necessarily following someone else's like laid out plan.
No, this was all kind of organic how it happened. The credit really goes to Jai. He was the innovator and the one trying all these things. I got relatively lucky with my first soil mix in that it was reasonably well balanced. We've improved it since then through soil testing, but it was close enough that it allowed him to get some pretty good results, and that really inspired us to take a science-based approach to this sort of style of growing that people call living soil now.
So with those first batches of soil, had you already made like an amended potting mix for vegetables or like fruit trees or anything like that up to that point?
No, that was really my first shot at mixing potting soils or formulating a soil mix. And to be fair, I put a lot of time into that. I did a lot of research, but no, I had never mixed soils before. This was a whole new endeavor. And one of the nice things about organics is there's definitely, people talk about, oh, I'm doing organics, I can throw away my pH pen, I don't have to worry about pH, or, I don't have to soil test and do those things. And then they talk about the buffering capacity of the microbes in the soil and all of that. And to a certain extent, that's true. So yes, in organics, we have a lot more capacity to, I guess, make mistakes or have a wider range of, what's going to work for a plant than you do in mineral salts. You over apply, nitrates in, growing with chemical salts, and you're going to really mess up your plant. Whereas in organics, you can probably get away with it. Maybe you can leach it. It's a little bit easier to work with. So all of that being said, we decided to take a science-based approach to this. If we know that, plants do better within certain pH ranges, if we can optimize that, the plant can put less energy into managing the pH in the rhizosphere, that area around the roots, and more energy into plant growth. So I would say pH still matters. Soil testing absolutely matters for balancing the minerals. But again, if you're just going to throw paint at the wall, you're probably going to get luckier in organics, get away with it more in organics than you would in using mineral salts.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I've definitely tried my hand at doing like an amended potting mix as well, and it worked out great. And I felt like the thing that I read, I've heard from like yourself in podcasts as well as some of your guests. Clackamas Coot definitely was one of the guys that influenced how I made this mix, and it was like this shotgun approach of providing a large buffet with a lot of little things to make sure that you had sort of that complete nutrient package. And then, some of it was probably a little too much. Like I probably went too heavy on the nitrogen, or I maybe could have added more calcium or something along those lines. But it did seem to just work. I think the reason why I said I probably could have gone less nitrogen is because nothing wanted to senesce. It just wanted to continue powering forward, sending out new growth. And, one thing that I'm always thinking about is allowing for substrate monitoring as well as environmental monitoring, and then the management of moisture content, heat to humidity ratios within the environment, as well as the substrate to control sort of a faster senescence. What are some of the ways that you've found success in controlling senescence within an organic amended substrate, especially within large substrate sizes?
Yeah, I want to back up for 1 second and just say that I think that we do see, like we said, this greater buffering capacity in organics, but I want to say that I've come a long ways in understanding that we can do this better by soil testing, and we can really dial things in, and that these online recipes that you see, like if you're a new grower and you go online, you see Subcool's soil recipe or any online recipe, I would just suggest that those are not the best way for mixing soils, because one of the components in all of these recipes is compost. And that variable alone is going to be so different. The compost you find locally versus the compost I'm using, or maybe I made myself, is going to have very different NPK levels. Mm-hmm. And so that can really throw off the whole recipe. So these online recipes are just they simply can't be accurate because of that compost fraction. And you can reduce that compost fraction, and that will help quite a bit. But just keep that in mind if you're thinking about trying this approach.
That's a great point. Thank you.
Yeah, but then getting back to your question about senescence and environment, my first thought when you said that your plant didn't want to finish was I would consider that the carbon dioxide levels during your night cycle were probably significantly higher, potentially like through the roof, because of the fact that you have a larger volume of living soil. So not only are you getting CO2 from the plant at night, but you're also getting it from the soil respiration. And I think those two combined could have pushed you up into a level that would have caused some weird new growth. We do see that with very high levels of CO2.
Yeah, I've seen that before as well. And, I didn't even think of that at the time, because I was ventilating the space throughout the day and the night. I didn't really have it set to hold temperature at night because it was in a lung room. But who knows, maybe that lung room CO2 was also just way up through the roof at night, which, yeah, I've totally seen that. I didn't think of that. That's a really great point. So when you do run into issues like that, are you suggesting ventilation of the space, or are there other ways that you sort of tackle an increase in senescence if something like that isn't available?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, I think it's most tied to photo period. So assuming you're on a 12-12 photo period and you're not getting light leaks, or something's happening where your timer was off and you didn't realize it, and you're truly on a 12-12 photo period, the next biggest variable, in my opinion, is genetics. So if your genetics are just such that they want a little bit more time, there's really nothing you can do to speed that up terribly. Beyond that, though, I don't know that I have any tricks for increasing senescence, other than we typically try to reduce stress by maintaining proper VPD levels, proper light levels, proper CO2. We were talking about this the other day. If you're not supplementing CO2, you probably don't need to go above 800 ppfd with your lights, because the plant's not going to be able to keep up. And concurrently, if you're running CO2 at 1200 ppms, but your lights are at 600 or 700 ppm, you're wasting your money on CO2. So all of these things, I think, in the environment really just need to be balanced and looked at as a whole. And that's the thing about growing, is it's so complicated. But once you understand all of these things, it becomes fairly simple to a certain extent too.
Yeah, we've talked about this with some other guests in the past, where it's we always suggest for newer growers, or even for experienced growers who want to try something new to see if it will have an effect on their garden, to only do it one step at a time to make sure that you can actually qualify and quantify those results that you're seeing. But then once you start to do this and you start to track all that data, then you can start to see how those different interactions and changes might play in concert with each other, and how they might have like a greater effect than the parts alone. And so I do agree with you on that once you do start to see and understand these different aspects of the grow, you can start to sort of synthesize your own knowledge about what's going to happen, and sort of, be fairly positive about the outcomes that you'll see based on the strategies that you take. So that's a great point. And you have so much experience seeing a bunch of different gardens and a bunch of different results with this product that you produce, your living soil. What are some of the... let's make this a two-part question. So with your living soil that you put out there for people... Yes.
Can I add something before you ask your question? Because I don't want to forget.
No, please.
So one thing I want to say is, I think that one of the things that's been really helpful for me is coming from a horticulture or a nursery background. I didn't get exposed to the cannabis information until later in sort of my cultivation journey. And, at the time, the only place you could get information was, there was a few online sites, but it's primarily like your local hydro shop. And it was whatever that guy ran. If he ran General Hydro, then he would tell you how great General Hydro was and how much better it was and everything else at the time. And you didn't really learn the mechanisms or understand the physiology of the plant or what was really going on. You learned how to use a product line.
Sure.
And a lot of that is marketing. A lot of these companies are using the exact same products. They're just packaging them a little different, or they're a little bit better at marketing them. And I think it's really hard to separate the marketing from the real information, especially nowadays on social media. Anyone can put up a pretty picture online, or a test result, or all these things. We don't know that they're true. We don't know all the failures or everything that went in the background. And we don't know what products are really helping. I remember we used to go to these, cannabis trade show, and you get all these different samples, and then you would go home to your garden and you'd start using them. And then your plant would finish and you'd be like, okay, that was really great. You would have no idea which product actually made a difference or what limiting factor it was addressing.
For sure.
And on the flip side, your plants might die because you might have massively over applied a single nutrient or something, and you would have no idea which of those products was bad. So this idea that we move one lever at a time is really, really important. And the other thing I just want to touch on is, I think in cannabis, you kind of already talked about this, people get very dogmatic. They get this idea that like biodynamics is the way to go. Soil food web is the way. This is just on the organic side,
Sure.
Permaculture, I don't know, this layer method I've heard about. Like, there's all these different ways, and people are convinced that that's the best way of growing. I would just suggest that people try to get out of that and look at it, like you said, from an anthropological perspective, and realize that everyone has an angle. Myself, as someone who manufactures living soils, I strongly believe that taking a science-based approach and the way we do it with data collection is the most sustainable and efficient way of growing. But I try to be open to new things as well, and try to learn and improve. We're always learning and improving what we're doing.
Sure.
But you do get these different sort of areas of the industry that become very cultish, and people are convinced that this is the best, and I think that I found the more confident and people are in a given, methodology or something, the less likely I am to want to try it or believe it. I always try to approach everything with sort of an air of skepticism in that regard.
Absolutely. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of different ways to quote unquote correctly grow this plant and to have success with it. And it reminds me of the saying is like, the more I know, the less I feel like I know, sort of mentality. Like, as you learn more about this plant and all the different ways that you can grow it, it almost feels like there are limitless ways to approach this, and you go from having potentially like a dogmatic view or a single narrative of this works for me and this is what I want to continue to do, so I'm going to get become the best at this. And as soon as you start to see these other methods working really well, you got to kind of reset that mentality and say, well, wait a minute, like all of these are working, so maybe me thinking that I know what I know here doesn't necessarily mean that I know everything or even close to it. So I do think that that's a really good way to approach this plant. And I do really agree with you as well that taking a scientific approach and trying to follow at least some sort of scientific method of, taking a task ahead of you and saying, okay, this is what I'm doing. I'm going to document it. I'm going to document the results, compare those to then the previous results as well as future results, and start to see where I can make more changes, less changes, what works, what doesn't work. And with your soil company, so kind of back to the question that I wanted to ask a little earlier, you've come. So it sounds like you started at one place where you were working with Jaya Palmer. You had a really great recipe right off the bat because you did your research. You knew what needed to go into it to have potential success. And then from there, though, you've made tweaks throughout the years. What are some of those key points within the history of the KiS soil? And I know that this does sound a little bit like I'm like, I want you to talk about your product, but I want you to talk about it from, the standpoint of everyone's had successes and had failures within things that they've tried out. So what were some of those key points along the journey of this soil recipe that you had to either make a change because something didn't work, or that you made a change because of some sort of research that you saw or you saw someone else having success with that you implemented and it worked out really well?
Yeah, those are great questions. So continuing this sort of evolution of my journey with Jaya, we mixed all these ingredients. He started doing all these trials. I started growing myself, and overall having pretty good results. In fact, the biggest challenge I had was learning IPM, which is a whole nother aspect of cultivation, understanding, how to care for your plants from that perspective. But on the fertility side, like I said, I think I put a lot of, I probably did the 10,000 hours thing that Malcolm Gladwell talks about, but then I also got lucky too. And so fast forward a few years from there, and Steve Solomon's book, The Intelligent Gardener, comes out. And I start reading more about soil testing and learning about mineral balancing and William Albrecht and that whole approach, which is the exact opposite of everything I'd been taught from Dr. Ingham in the soil food web community. And I started learning more and more about that and doing some soil testing and learning how to interpret and understand how potting soils with soil testing are different than actual soils, and how cannabis targets are different than other vegetable targets and other, crops that we already have targets for, like corn and tomatoes and things like that. So that was a whole journey. And through that process, we were mixing soils and testing them. We were working with the local horticultural college, Lake Washington College. I was good friends with the founder of that program, the professor over there. And so he actually did some trials for us with re-amending. We tried stuff with high levels of rock dust. We tried Steve Solomon's actual complete organic fertilizer. We tried our nutrient pack and different formulations with and without biochar to try and get some more ideas of how plants responded. And so getting that trial information was actually really crucial for me in making decisions about our formulations and moving forward. And where I'm at now, I've learned is that there's really three parts to making good soil. And the first is sort of the physical properties of that soil, which is the, people are familiar with like the Cornell mix, which would be like a third compost, a third peat moss, and a third aeration. We've since adjusted that in terms of reducing the amount of compost to reduce heavy metals and some other things. That variability that compost brings in can be quite large. But that, we want to look at gas exchange, we want to look at drainage, moisture retention, and that's just the physical properties of the soil. So then the next one would be the biological properties of the soil, and this is where that whole soil food web comes in. And we're talking about how when we add organic fertilizer like alfalfa meal to the soil, it's not actually in the form the plant can uptake, and it has to be broken down by the microbes and then made available to the plant. And that's a very important process in organic cultivation. But I don't like to make data-driven decisions around it, which is something that is big in the soil food web community. They're looking almost exclusively at the microbes. And what I found is that that's just not a great way to cultivate, and it doesn't reflect how we work in the horticultural world, for example. And it's why it's sort of a fringe thing that you only find for the most part, in cannabis and really extreme permaculture. Whereas a soil test, which is the third tripod here, this triangle, which is the chemical makeup of that soil, so how much nitrogen, how much phosphorus, how much calcium, and if we can get those all at least a sufficient level, if not a luxury level, and in good balance, I find the microbes take care of themselves for the most part. I mean, we're going to use good organic practices regardless. And so that's where I really find a lot of my focus goes now, which is a big change from where I started. So when you asked about like what's changed in my journey, that's probably the biggest change. Is I'm much more focused now on using soil testing as a way of determining fertility and quality versus, the compost teas and the microbe side. I think that has a place, but I think it's more as a supplement than as the main driver in determining how I'm going to manage my cultivation. Because, we've gotten to, over the years, work with people in, all around the world, in Australia, in Malawi, in Thailand, in Hawaii, all these different environments, and looking for ways, you learn a lot from having to work with limited resources and different cultivars and all these things. And one of the things I've learned is that controlling for these, the levels of nutrients is really the best way that we can manage fertility in these soil mixes. So that's the biggest change I've found in my journey.
For sure. I feel like that's such a pragmatic approach to say, I'm going to focus on the physical properties, like the actual physical makeup, and the and then the like constituents that you're putting into it, and what those ratios are, and how you can make something that's sort of uniform. And so, but the biology question, that always does get me as well, because I've always heard, that different biologies within the substrate will produce different results, in a sense. Mm-hmm. Like some are able to process phosphorus or potassium or nitrogen or calcium at different rates and with different levels of efficiency of use of the source material.
Yeah.
Have you ever found that there are some biologies that just don't work with your substrate mix? Like, have you ever encountered a compost or a other source of biology and microorganisms that you're putting into that soil that have caused sort of either like an adverse reaction or an unfavorable result?
Yeah, let me put it this way. So you're absolutely right that different microbes are going to be better at utilizing or unlocking phosphorus or calcium or these different things, or cycling nutrients. And I think the thing to keep in mind, well, there's two main points I would make around this. One is that I went to this soil science, the International Soil Science Society of America had this conference in San Francisco or San Diego years ago. And I got to go because they wanted, the Washington State University reached out to me because they wanted someone to present on sort of the state of cannabis in relation to soil science. And so I got to go there, and I got to attend all these other talks. And one of them was this person looking at soil biology as it changed in soils relative to hydrology, so watering events. Okay. And what they found essentially was that when you watered your plant or when there was a rain event, the biology would change dramatically. The fungal to bacterial levels were changed dramatically. And so I think that's first and foremost really interesting, because people tend to think of their soil as homogeneous, like, oh, my soil has this fungal to bacterial ratio, or my soil has this, these aerobic bacteria. But really, there's all these little micro pockets and little tiny, climates and environment, which is important for roots, because we need anaerobic microorganisms for some things, which are ones that, want low to no oxygen conditions. And we want ones that are highly aerobic too. So they work in a balance, essentially. And we don't need to manage that ourselves. That's something that it can kind of manage on its own.
So, yeah, this is just so fascinating. Right, water levels, right? That'll change the biology, the fungal to bacteria ratio.
Right.
And all of those components, which all have different sorts of effects on the soil, right? Like if it's some sort of a detritivore fungus, then you're going to get a lot more potential like media breakdown, right? Like your compost fraction might become higher because the peat moss is being composted at that point, or something along those lines. Whereas if you have like a higher bacteria ratio, then maybe you have a higher breakdown or cycling of like nitrogen or phosphorus or calcium. So when you have faced these things, like what did that inform for you in terms of the decisions that you made to change your inputs of the media that you were mixing at the time?
Well, I think you hear some communities saying, oh, you need this sort of fungal to bacteria ratio for cannabis, or you got diseases, because you weren't using a complete compost, or your plant had these fertility issues because your compost didn't have the right microbes, and that all soils contain sufficient minerals. You just need to get the microbes right. And all of those statements, in my opinion, are just patently false. And we know that these things are complex. We know that we don't fully understand them. And we know that we can manage them through what fertilizers and minerals and fertility we're adding. So, you add some alfalfa meal, like I said, to that soil, that's going to dramatically cause a bloom in microorganism growth. And so if we want to utilize microbes or think about microbes, I would say there's certain practices that are going to encourage good microbial activity, such as proper watering habits, first and foremost. If we can keep that soil evenly moist through proper watering, then we're going to have a much better microbial community. We can use larger volumes of soil. That's going to make things a lot easier. It's not going to dry out as much. We're going to have better nutrient cycling and all of that. So I think there's things that we can do, outdoors, using a mulch, keeping the soil covered, cover cropping. All of those things have been shown to be really good for soil health. I think the biggest thing I learned is that not all those practices transfer well indoors, and that just because something happens in nature doesn't mean that it's optimal for plant growth or plant health. This idea of mimicry of Mother Nature is, I think, a false premise for making decisions about our cultivation in our gardens, especially indoors. Because I do see people saying, okay, well, because nature does, nature never likes bare soil indoors, we want to have a cover crop. I'd say, okay, well, nature would also have what we call weeds. Nature would have flood events. Nature would have all these different things happening that we don't get in an indoor environment. That's why we call it controlled environment agriculture. And I can make a very good case for why cover crops may not be the best choice indoors, based on the fact that they're, creating habitat for pests and pathogens, which can get out of control because we don't have natural enemies for them that are just coming in to control their populations indoors. They're another crop that we have to manage. They can outcompete for fertility. There's a bunch of things that you should consider when making a decision, versus just looking at whether or not it happens in nature. Because I grew up an organic guy, things that I think about things from that perspective, and that really fits with my mindset. And so it took me a long time to kind of wrap my brain around the fact that maybe I need to approach it from a different angle to become a better cultivator.
For sure. I mean, one of the things that I point out to people right away is that as soon as you move them in under artificial lighting, you're providing them consistent lighting for whatever your decision is in terms of that photoperiodism. And that is seldom, if ever, the case if you're growing outside. Like maybe if you're in a light diffused greenhouse, will you have somewhat even lighting throughout a day, but that might just be one day, and then the next day it won't be even because of cloud coverage or just a more peak UV exposure or something along. Like nature is weird. It doesn't just follow a set of rules. It kind of does its own thing on a day-to-day basis based on a whole bunch of different changes globally. So to try and say, oh, I'm going to try and do biomimicry in an indoor setting, I do believe that you're kind of defeating the purpose of growing indoors in the first place. Like you're saying, it's controlled environment agriculture, not let the environment run wild with it and see what the end results are. So I do really appreciate that approach, especially when it does come to a living soil, because I do feel as though, we've now talked on it a few times, but it is so important to bring up that when people, they just start adding stuff to a grow, I feel like I do see that happen a lot in mineral salt based like hydroponic growing. People will just start throwing stuff at the wall to see if it sticks, but at the same time I see it happening in organic growing as well. And sometimes because of what you've mentioned before, that there is sort of this there's this boon to growing in like a large amended substrate, that if you throw a bunch of stuff at it, you're more than likely not going to fail. You just may not necessarily be doing it in the most efficient or measurable method possible. What are some other things that you've sort of experienced in your journey that were like a big learning lesson for you, whether it be through your own indoor growing or through experiences in your consulting or helping other people with their gardens? What were some of those experiences?
Yeah, I have some answers there. I don't normally promote products, but I'm staring at this and you brought up light. And so I just want to mention this for folks. This is from a company called Photone, and it's a diffuser that works with your phone. I just made a video on our YouTube about it as a review, because I have a par meter here.
Like an Apogee or something?
This is Apogee Components. It's a Sun system.
Sure.
This thing's like $400. This is $28. And I did some testing and they were very close. But I think everyone should be measuring the light in their room and knowing how far away your plant is from that light if you're growing indoors. And for under $30, I think it's a really great tool that everyone should utilize. Cool. So I just want to mention that as
I just had a buddy get one and
about.
He loves it. He's like, dude, it's so accurate. It's like within 5%, like all the time at all different light levels. And I'm like, that's super impressive for just a diffuser. So yeah, definitely. No worries.
Yeah. So I just think people should be measuring light. But in terms of getting back to your question about like things that I've learned, I think the biomimicry one was a big one. Sort of moving towards soil testing was a big one. Cover crops and mulching was sort of the other one that I think of that I've really learned a lot about over the years. That I think I made mistakes around that because I wanted that it fits with sort of what I want to see out there. I think, okay, well, cover crops work well outdoors. Tilling, no-till is another one too. Like outdoors, there's reasons why we don't till, or we want to have less soil disturbance because it damages the soil microorganisms and it causes erosion, which, created the Dust Bowl because the wind will literally take our topsoil away. And so there's a lot of reasons not to till outdoors. But then when I started applying that indoors, I found, okay, well, if I have some soil disturbance, me getting in there with my hands and mixing in organic nutrients or using a shovel is not the same level of disturbance that you get from, running a mechanical tiller across an agricultural field. And so I started doing some trials with that, and we found that disturbance wasn't actually a bad thing. And it allowed us, by not having a cover crop, we were able to, mix the soil more thoroughly and get the nutrients that we wanted down into the rhizosphere faster. Because when you just top dress organic nutrients, whether it's our nutrient pack or, bone meal, blood meal, any of these sorts of things, it has to work its way down through the soil profile, and that takes time. And so getting that stuff down into the soil at the beginning of the cycle and making it more homogeneous just speeds everything up. Because one of the things, at least on the commercial scale, is we don't have time is your enemy. We got to get at least 5 cycles in a year. Crop cycles. There's a big difference getting that 5th crop versus only having 4 crops, or even, pushing it a little more. So having downtime in between grow cycles is just not feasible. Home grower, whatever, but on the commercial scale, we had to come up with a way to do it as efficiently as possible. So the process right now is typically in the flower room, you're in beds. You would send off for a soil test a few weeks prior to harvest, same time period, same week, every cycle. We get the results back probably a week before you're harvesting, analyze the results, and then send you a custom recommendation based off that soil test and say, okay, you're going to add this much soft rock phosphate, this much fish meal, whatever, to keep your heavy metals low, to make sure we're not over applying nutrients, nothing's building up. Different cultivars are going to pull nutrients differently, different environments. If you have higher lights, higher CO2, you're going to be pulling more nutrients. And so we can look at all that and make adjustments each cycle. And so you would harvest your plant normally, pull out the root system, because that's going to contain the highest levels of viroids as well as heavy metals. So we'll pull that out, and then we'll you take it, harvest normally, and then come back in, apply the custom prescription per yard, mix that into the soil, and then a day later you're bringing in your next your veg crop back into the flower room and getting it ready for that next flower cycle. So you may plant, wait 3 or 4 days to let that plant adjust to the new transplant environment, and then flip in the lights to that 12-12 photo period. So that's the fastest way we found that allows us to maintain a cycle similar to what you'd get if you were growing, with mineral salts.
Sure.
But get all the benefits of organic production.
Is that about a 5-day turnaround then from the end of one flower cycle to the beginning of another flower cycle?
Yeah, so you can bring in your next crop 24 hours later. So you could be planted in the room the next day from harvest. Sure. But then we want to wait, I'd say 3 is sort of a minimum number. Most people do 5 days to a week, and of just letting the plant get used to that transplant and get more comfortable before because you're stressing it out with the transplant, and then you're stressing it even further with hormonal changes when you flip the lights to 12-12. So
sure. We're
trying to just reduce a little bit of that stress there. And there's other things that we like to do during that period to help reduce that stress. But as a general rule, that works pretty well.
Cool. What are some of the general practices that you like to suggest for people regarding irrigation and environmental management that help promote robust and healthy living soil?
Yeah, that's a really tough one because it's such a complicated question and everyone's environment is different. I'm going to water a 7-gallon pot very differently than I am a 4x4 bed with a foot of soil in it.
Sure.
So in general, I think having a way to quantify soil moisture is really handy. There's a bunch of different tools out there. There's a pulse meter from Blue Lab that will give you a volumetric measure of your soil moisture content and percentage. The Blue Mat moisture meter will give you a reading in M-bar, and we can say, okay, this is the reading we're shooting for here. And then when it drops below this point, you'll do a watering event. And that way you can kind of have a more quantifiable or data-driven way of doing it rather than just kind of sticking your finger in the soil and seeing if it's moist, especially if you're a new grower. Now, if you're if you've been growing for a long time and are comfortable with that process, then there are ways to do it without using a moisture meter.
Sure.
But that's the biggest thing, is keeping the soil properly moist. And there are irrigation systems, like blue mats, for example, that we use in some situations that work really well. So yeah, it just depends.
For sure.
And then on the environment, I want to say, VPD is really, really important. So understanding that relationship between humidity and temperature. And so I recommend going on the Dr. Greenhouse website. She even has an app, VPD app, that you can download from the App Store, and you can put in your temperature and humidity, and it'll tell you where you land if you're in the right area there for where your plant should be. And I think that's crucial for reducing pathogens and just growing a happy, healthy plant.
Definitely. I was trying to tease out of you just a little bit in terms of the irrigation practices. So like one of the things that I always suggest to people is you never want to have like a runoff event typically, unless you're actually pushing for like a leaching event of some sort of issue within the substrate, especially in a living soil setting, as well as consistency in watering. I think some people will, especially with large substrates, they'll think, oh, I'll just water it once a week. And I say, well, how about you take that volume and break it into 7 different irrigations and do it once a day? Are there anything like that you've run into that you've found to be sort of a best practice that produces more consistent results?
Yeah. So in small containers, like say a 4-inch pot or a 1-gallon pot, you're going to have runoff, and I think that's normal and fine. And the way I like to water my plants, I thought it was called the pulse watering technique, though I went and looked that up and I couldn't find a lot of information online about it. But that was how it was described to me. And essentially it's just like if you had 10 pots in a row, I'd start at the first one, I'd give it a little bit of water, I'd go to the next one, give it a little bit of water, and go all the way down, and then come back to that first pot. Is there water coming out the bottom? No. Okay, well, I'm going to give it a little more water, and then go all the way back down the line. The challenge with that is if you have a peat-based soil, which most of these soils are, and that soil got really dry, as in hydrophobic, that water can literally just run right through the pot without wetting the soil. So one thing I find with potting soils is you got to kind of scrape back the surface after you water and see that it's actually saturating the soil and not just running through. Because you could be shocked. You could scratch back a little bit and realize like that soil is bone dry underneath there, and the water really just ran through the pot. So that's sort of the first thing. And then I have a couple thoughts on the watering, because I like the idea of multiple water events versus one huge event, but that comes with a caveat. You're never going to kill your plant by overwatering it in a single watering event. The way you kill your plant is giving it a little bit of water over and over and over again. And so that plant never gets that like gas exchange. You don't get that dry down, which, it's not a massive dry down, but it's a little bit. And that's really important for healthy roots, because oxygen has to get into there. And if if it's just perpetually wet and soaked, you're not really getting that. So that's really my only concern with that is, yes, it could be more optimal in a lot of cases, but you also have more of a potential for certain pathogens, soil pathogens, because of that. So I would say, as a general rule, I'm watering every 2 to 4 days.
Okay.
In your, in living soils, depending on, your room temperature, the amount of wind that's going across the leaves that increases your, evapotranspiration, your humidity, all those things are going to impact how often you have to water. And also the stage of growth of the plant. Once you get later in flower, you're going to be watering a lot less than you would say week 2, week 3, when you're sort of starting to see some more stretch and a lot of real growth happening. Yeah, that's a tricky one, because it's very situational.
When you are, so like you just said, you're probably watering less towards the end of flower. And let's say you are using one of those blue mats moisture content readouts, and you're getting the M-bar reading. Is that target that you want the soil moisture to be at, is that a moving target throughout the cycle, or do you like to keep it consistent all the way up through harvest?
I think a lot of growers keep it consistent throughout harvest. Let's say 80 M-bar, just as if you are using blue mats, is a good general, and it's going to vary depending on substrate. I'm going to talk about using it in our soils because that's what I'm most familiar with. But if a soil had very different levels of compost or peat or held moisture a lot differently, it could make a difference. Yeah, we do have some growers that will turn it back one notch, so make it a little bit drier the last week or so, or they will just take out the blue mats a week early and allow the plants to dry down a little bit more prior to harvest. But then we have other growers that will just run it through. So I think you could experiment. I don't know that we necessarily have a best practice at this point, but in general, we recommend reducing watering towards the end of the last week or so, or if you are hand watering, cutting out that last watering event prior to harvest, just to remove some of the moisture out of the plant before you start drying and curing.
For sure. I mean, we will, in like a hydroponic setting, definitely push for like a series of greater drybacks. If you're irrigating daily towards the end of flower, to push a little bit more of like a generative cue within the plant for a senescence event. And so, I always wondered with that, especially considering how important the moisture content is for the continued nutrient cycling within the substrate of living soil, as well as if you're going to then be resetting it within a few days of that harvest to then have a successive crop going in there. And if any of those sort of dryback practices might be detrimental to that following crop or even to the plant itself, especially considering how important calcium is towards the end of flower to maintain cell structure and the health of the plant overall, and reduce things like pathogen development, botrytis, mildews, things like that. So I really appreciate that answer, and to know that people are still doing some sort of dryback practice at the end. That's really fascinating. Have you ever seen someone do a side-by-side trial where they ran it the same target water content all the way through harvest versus the same cultivar getting a reduced dryback or an increased dryback towards the end? And was there any sort of change in the morphology or the rate of senescence, like whether it be coloring or trichome density or aromas within the plants that you've seen, if you have seen something like that side by side?
Yeah, I haven't seen anyone run an exact side by side like that. Typically, the commercial growers we work with are reducing watering just as a general rule. Maybe that's more related to the fact that they have to dry things faster. But I couldn't really say. No, I haven't seen anyone run that. I do want to speak though really quickly on the resiliency of these microorganisms.
Sure.
Yeah, a dryback is not killing microbes. I mean, it is a little bit, but everything kills microbes. So the thing is, you have to understand there's so many of them, and the biodiversity that we have in soils is so great that these microbes have mechanisms, physiological mechanisms for dealing with dry conditions, for dealing with wet conditions, for going for a while, without food sources. So, like right now, I shut down my grow for the summer. I didn't want to deal with the heat. And so people ask like, are all the microbes dying? Do you need to keep watering it the whole time that you're not growing, or do you need to plant another plant in there? And, I could, but that's a lot of electricity, a lot of time and labor that I don't want to spend on that. When I'm ready to grow again, I'm going to slowly re-wet the soil, maybe give it a little food source, some organic fertilizer, like some alfalfa meal, or a little bit of diluted molasses to just wake things up. And then it's going to be ready to go. I don't need to worry about the fact that the microbes right now are probably dry and not very active because that soil's dried out. And I've done this, that I've done multiple times. And, if you think about it, outside, you have these, you have these microorganisms going through freezing events. You have them going for long periods without water, periods with too much water. They're designed to be able to survive all of these processes.
For sure. Yeah, and I guess, you have those different selective pressures within the outdoor environment. And so the things that work within it are going to continue to work. So yeah, I think that's a great point, because, that's where I feel like there is a lot of misunderstanding within living soil, is this need to keep that soil alive through the, like the addition of a plant, right? Of a root system, of some sort of rhizosphere that's causing these interactions to continue to take place, as though if they stop, that cycling will never be able to pick back up again. But I feel like that's a good demystifying of that sort of myth that, it can totally go through that extreme dryback. And like you said, you just need to make sure that you know what you're doing when you're starting it back up again, like maybe wetting it down completely and like saturating it to full field capacity as soon as you want to get back into it might not be the best practice, because maybe you're going to create some anaerobic pockets within there that aren't going to create the desired effects that you're looking for, versus what you're saying, adding a food source, some sort of like carbohydrate to the soil to awaken those microbes again and get them moving and grooving so that they're ready to start that nutrient cycling process and have that rhizosphere interaction that we're looking for. So I think that's a really great nugget of information.
I wanted to get back really quickly. You talked about this idea of drybacks, and really to me what you're talking about there is plant stress, and how does plant stress impact yields? How does it impact trichome development, cannabinoids, terpenes, all those things? And we have some research on this in other plants and even in cannabis. In fact, I just did an interview on my podcast with a researcher specifically looking at secondary metabolites and how they're impacted by these stress events. And so what I would say is, yes, a little bit of stress causes, greater cannabinoid production, but it also is going to impact your yield. So there's a trade-off there. I use the example usually of like that seed that ended up on your compost pile that or that plant you threw out that you never thought was going to grow, and then somehow it survived, and you smoked it and it was the best weed you've ever had, but it was this like sad looking plant that had obviously been very stressed. And you hear these stories, and basically what's happening is this plant's trying to survive. It's producing these defense mechanisms, these trichomes, and so you get putting a lot more energy into cannabinoids and trichome development and all of that. But the yields are going to be quite low. So there's this dance that we're doing, and we haven't figured out, and it's going to vary because we have so much diversity in cannabis genetically. This isn't going to work for every plant. We can't say a dryback week 3 on all cultivars is going to cause this, the perfect balance of like terpene and cannabinoid expression, yet not reduce our yields more than 3%. That just doesn't exist, and that data can't exist. But we do know that certain stress events will trigger greater production of these secondary metabolites. So in general, what I try to tell people is we unintentionally stress our plants all the time, every cycle. No one has a perfect cycle. So I wouldn't get too caught up with intentionally introducing plant stress unless you've got everything just dialed in perfectly. And I think that's so rare, especially in a commercial facility, because there's so many challenges around running things on scale. But I always start with trying to get less plant stress. And then I figure I'll get it unintentionally, or I can always introduce it at the very end of the cycle when I have the least risk for pests and pathogens. I don't want to be stressing the plant week 3, knowing that I might be opening myself up to powdery mildew or botrytis or other things down the road, because that plant is now lacking the water, or it has too much heat, or other things that might be causing it to not have an optimal immune response.
For sure. I always think about the sort of the tomato industry when I think about plant stresses and the efficient utilization of increasing and decreasing abiotic stressors within the plant, and how you can take a vining tomato and grow it for 8 months with a 4 to 5 day harvest interval, and just through the and I, you have like vegetative versus generative stressors and lack of stressors, I guess. So like I always think of vegetative growth as the ability to replicate a decrease in abiotic stress, and a generative result as being something that was a result of increase in abiotic stress. And so you can definitely apply those, but you have to do them so judiciously. You cannot use them to try and achieve a result that you wouldn't necessarily be able to achieve 90% of the way there just through your regular cultivation practices. And so I do appreciate that you're not bringing it up as something that everyone should try, because like you said, we run into problems all the time in growing. I mean, they are plants, and plants, they're a living organism, so they're going to react to things sometimes very fast and very drastically, and you need to kind of, especially in a living soil situation, it's more of like a ship, and to steer that ship you need to make very small adjustments rather than drastic adjustments, like foregoing a few irrigation events because you think that it might produce a who knows what result, right? A danker bud. So yeah, that's a very great point. And it is something that people need to be very weary about when implementing, if they don't have everything perfectly dialed in. And kind of along the lines of that thought process of, if we want to achieve the best results in our garden, we definitely want to try to reduce what we might consider to be problems, whether those be stress events or losing control of some sort of equipment, lighting schedules being messed up, applying a nutrient that might have been pushing towards toxicity, or missing the application of nutrients and leading towards deficiencies. I feel like there's such a concert that requires a director sort of approach of making sure that everything works together. And with your level of experience, seeing how so many different environments and so many different practices have been implemented, where do you see some of the most important parts of the grow being? Whether that be through like the practices or through specific styles of cultivation, or maybe specific things that you've experienced where you're like, if everyone needs to think about this.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for me would be IPM, so integrated pest management, thinking about things from a hygienic or cleanliness perspective, and how do we keep our plants clean and healthy. And that starts sort of, my friend Justin likes to use this analogy of a river. So you always want to start at the top, where at the beginning of the river, and that's your mother stock. And your mother plants always need to be the healthiest plants in your facility or in your grow room. If your plants or your clones going into veg, going into flower are not healthy, well, let's just say into flower specifically, though stress events in veg will ultimately have the ability to impact your final yield and your final plant expression. But really, really healthy mother stock, healthy veg stock make all the difference in the world. And so I would say starting there. And so if you're in a facility, for example, this works the same way. Like you would always go look at your oldest plants first. So you would start with your mother stock, and you'd work in that room first in the morning. And then from there you would move to your veg plants. And then from there all the way down until your last plants that are that are flowering and ready to be harvested, that would be the last room you go into. You wouldn't want to go backwards and risk exposing anything that had happened in flower back into veg. So, some of this is common sense, but these things are really important, because will visit a lot of facilities and they don't have these practices in place. And even as a home grower, I want you to think about this. Like, was I just out working in my vegetable garden? I'm not going to go straight back into my cannabis garden. I'm going to change my shoes. I'm going to change my clothes. I'm going to be thoughtful about what I might be bringing into my room or my space, so that I can avoid problems down the road. Because you'll hear people say like, oh, I've never had thrips or spider mites or whatever. And that's great. Maybe they're in an environment where there's not a lot of pest pressure, but you're definitely opening yourself up to those opportunities. I mean, botrytis spores are in the air, powdery mildew spores are in the air. You can carry them in on your body. We just want to limit exposures in that way. And so that's probably the biggest thing that's kind of across any method of cultivation, is just thinking about your IPM strategy.
For sure. That's such a great answer, because it is, it's vital. And, people will talk about maybe not having experienced pests before, so they say, well, I don't even know what to do about them, because I just haven't experienced them. And then when they experience them, in so many ways, it can be sort of the straw that breaks the camel's back for a lot of growers, where if they run into pests or pathogens, that might be the end of their growing career. If it is for home growing, or like even in a commercial space, it can be devastating if you lose part of a crop, especially with some of these larger facilities, and just the overall investment in a single room per run can be, it can be detrimental to a business. So I do think that that's extremely important for people to consider. With your soil and the methods that you use, do you feel as though there's anything that's unique to your approach to cultivation that you don't necessarily see elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're the only company that I know of that's making soils and looking at, doing as much soil testing as we are, looking at heavy metal levels, really focused on a science-based approach, and instead of a marketing approach, I guess, to a lot of what we do. So I think that's pretty unique to us. There are some things that we've kind of like tips and tricks that we've learned with our soils that work really well. Like you asked about microbes. There are a compost tea, a transplant from rooted clone into a veg pot, we found helps if it's made properly. Something like a commercial product like Microbial mass that is good at unlocking phosphorus and calcium and these other things in organic soils, we found when applied at application rates, pays for itself in terms of yield increases. And then an application of potassium, week 3 or week 4 of flower as additional boost, we found increases our yields in a lot of cases, unless we have a soil test showing that they're already too high in potassium or they're out of balance. But those are sort of the tips and tricks and unique things that we've learned over the years relative to living soils and our soils, that stand out to me. I mean, I know there's more that I'm not thinking of, but yeah, we really just try to take a science-based approach to this whole theory. I mean, even though we're organic, and that's really important to us, we don't want to be dogmatic. We want to keep learning, and we want to apply science to it. Just because you're organic doesn't mean you can't use science, I guess, is the biggest takeaway. Yeah.
That sounds like a great slogan. Just because you're organic doesn't mean you shouldn't apply science.
Yeah, it's not as catchy as I would like, but it is.
No,
I think it's important because
it is.
Yeah, it's just not a bunch of hippies with dreadlocks, though.
For sure.
We have one on staff that's our agronomist too, so I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I think that stereotype, we just throw stuff at the soil. I don't think we have to do that anymore. We've learned a lot in the last decade. I completely agree. The advancements in cannabis cultivation that have been made over the past decade seem to have far outpaced the 50 years prior, which is a lot when you're sort of a burgeoning new industry that's semi-legal, whatever it is that we're at right now and whatever the future may hold. And, kind of speaking along those lines of what the future may hold and your experience within
dealing with the cannabis industry, what are some of the things that you might like to see change within the cannabis industry itself, whether that be from a commercial standpoint, from a home grow standpoint, or even from, the point of view that you probably take every day as someone who is a supplier to both sides of the coin there?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for me that I think about right now is sustainability. So I think the term organic and regenerative, these terms have sort of been overused. I think about, does that neem cake that comes all the way from India, is that worth the cost versus something like insect frass or blood meal or bone meal that can be produced here in the United States for a fraction of the cost, the fossil fuel cost to get it here? So looking at it from a sustainability perspective and sort of a carbon tax perspective, I think is really important when we think about our supply and logistics. But I think living soils in general is the most sustainable option because we're reusing our media and we're using organic inputs. It tends to be safer. So those are all aspects that I really love about what I do. The things that I think about in my home garden the most lately in my own health is PFAS, microplastics, and heavy metals. And cannabis has come under a lot of scrutiny in the last few years, and the regulations around them in some states are very, very tight, much tighter than we have for a lot of our food production, unfortunately. And so, but I do worry about, the combustion of these things, like what that might be doing to people's health, especially medical patients, as cannabis expands. And so it's something that we're actively learning about ourselves. I mean, I got to fly to Australia to give a talk at a conference down there specifically on heavy metals because there isn't a lot of information about organics and heavy metals and what sort of thresholds and things we need to look for to limit heavy metals in our soils and therefore in our plants, because cannabis is such a hyper accumulator. So that's what's been on my mind lately. And we're actively always looking to reduce the level of microplastics, PFAS, and heavy metals in our soil mixes through our sourcing. And it's a lot of testing, it's a lot of learning. But I think that's sort of the next big thing in gardening and cannabis in general.
For sure. I mean, man, that opens up a few questions for me because, sustainability and also like as it relates to what source materials you're using, I feel like is one of those topics that sometimes will get swept under the rug because it is a little bit uncomfortable to talk about certain things that may work really well within a garden, but that may not necessarily be coming from a place of sustainability or even, with human rights taken into consideration. What are some products or source materials that you have started to either move away from or that you completely avoid altogether and suggest other people do as well for some of these reasons?
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is bat guanos. I've never used bat guanos, so it wasn't an issue, but they destroy the ecology in most cases where they're harvested, the local ecology. They're dangerous for the workers who have to harvest them. And they're also potentially dangerous for the growers that are using them. In fact, I think some growers in New York recently, cannabis growers, passed away from histoplasmosis, which is a bacteria found in these guanos.
Yeah.
So I could usually tell if someone used bat guanos on their soil test because their available phosphorus is quite good. So there are reasons why I think people have used them for years, but I choose to avoid them for those reasons. And they're harvested far away typically, so it's a fossil fuel cost to get them to us. I just think there's better options. On the flip side, an example of this sort of marketing versus science thing is this idea of industrial byproducts from our meat industry, things like feather meal, bone meal, blood meal. They sound really gross, right? Like when we think about what our industrial meat industry is doing, it's pretty horrible, right? And these are byproducts of it. So this is an interesting question though, because one of my competitors put out this whole article and push of why they don't use bone meal or blood meal because it's, you're supporting a bad industry. It contains all these toxic chemicals and hormones and what else? Yeah, you're getting all these growth hormones, heavy metals, all of these things. And I listened to it and it was very compelling. And so I tried to do some research, and frankly, there wasn't a lot of information available, but I was able to find one really solid paper out of Europe on that topic. And they looked at the levels of heavy metals and PFAS and or BPA and all of these things, bacterial levels in bone meal and blood meal and feather meal. And what they found was these sources are actually pretty clean. Much cleaner than a lot of the other sources that they were looking at, including compost, for example. So I think it's interesting that people will say, okay, it's okay to use a cow manure compost, but it's not okay to use bone meal when bone meal is one of the cleanest heavy metal sources. And frankly, our beef industry is not going anywhere, whether we like it or not. I mean, I can choose not to support it by my own choices with where I buy my beef, for example. But realistically, that is a byproduct that can end up in a landfill or a feed store as a food additive for animals, or it can end up supplying my plants with adequate calcium and phosphorus, because we have to get phosphorus from somewhere, and there's a massive shortage of phosphorus in general. So these are all things to think about when you're thinking about sourcing things and separating sort of marketing from science too. And if you want to see more on that particular topic, you can go on our YouTube channel and check that out.
For sure.
I post on that.
Yeah, I think that thank you for indulging me there. I think that it's a touchy subject for a lot of people. Like, one of the things that I will bring up sometimes on top of that is also sort of like seabird guano, due to sort of the historical complexities of seabird guano and how there were wars fought over it, and even now still the sort of the risk factor of harvesting seabird guano and where it comes from, right? If it's coming across the Pacific on a giant oil rigger sort of deal, and you're putting out all that pollution, how organic is it? So yeah, I think you touched on all the notes that I was hoping you would, because I think I've learned a fair amount of that from you actually, and from your podcast. I think that we've pretty much touched on everything that I was thinking of today, and I'd kind of like to open it up to see if there was anything that we didn't touch on that you wanted to talk about, that either maybe something current that's going on with you, or within the production of organic living soil, or your business, or otherwise. Was there anything else that you'd like to talk about?
Not really. I'll just say that, I'm really grateful to be a part of this industry, and to have been a part of this industry for so long. It's been, there's been some tough years for sure for the cannabis industry, in general. And so I'm just grateful to still be around and be a part of it as a small business. If you are a grower and are interested in learning more, please don't hesitate to reach out. We do work with growers of all sizes, whether you have 3 plants or 3,000 plants, you can always reach out for information, and we try to treat everybody the same. And there's so much more that we're learning. I love having a podcast like you do too. So you get to interview and talk to people. I'm very grateful for the network that I've been able to grow, because there's a lot I don't know, but I probably know a guy kind of thing that has an answer, or girl, to be fair, because a lot of the smartest people in this industry that I work with are actually women, especially with entomology and airflow, off the top of my head. So yeah. And I will mention, I totally forgot. We have a conference coming up called the Cannabis, Cultivation, and Science Conference in Bozeman, Montana. I probably should plug that because I'm really excited about it. It's going to be September 5th through the 7th. We're having a lot of the people that have been on my podcast, some of the top industry experts, out to speak on everything from airflow to entomology to fertility, all of these different topics. And The third day is going to be, it's included as part of the ticket. We're going to have a tasting event sponsored by the Montana Living Soil Alliance. And so they're going to donate a bunch of weed, and people can come in and try the best of what Montana has to offer for living soil weed. And it's just going to be a lot of fun. I'm really looking forward to it. And Bozeman's awesome. And the place that's hosting it, Collective Elevation, one of the nicest facilities I've ever been to. So they're going to have tours and everything. Yeah, if you're interested, please come hang out with us.
Yeah, that's sweet. And yeah, definitely as a little shout out plug for your show, anybody that wants to like learn about organic gardening, I would suggest start at the first episode and just start listening through the Cannabis Cultivation and Science podcast, because it helped educate me in a lot of different ways. And one of the biggest ones was definitely with like Suzanne Wainwright Evans. Like it's pretty much a master class in cannabis integrated pest management. And I use some of the methodologies that she described on your show in commercial cultivation right now, every week. And it's definitely a great source of information. And so, thank you for what you do. You've definitely inspired a lot of people to grow organically, or just start growing in general, or even like this podcast that I'm doing. It does have a little bit of a mirror to your podcast, where I do like to interview people that are doing cannabis cultivation and finding out sort of what their practices are, what goes on in their mind when they think about approaching cannabis from, a variety of different aspects. And so, thank you for what you've done. It's great. And I really do appreciate your time here today. I do have a couple wrap up questions that I like to ask everyone, because, this is a cannabis podcast. And so I'm going to need to ask you some cannabis specific questions.
All right, let's do it.
All right. So what is your favorite cultivar or strain of all time?
Oh, so let me preface this by saying that my endocannabinoid system is very different than, say, even my brothers or my fathers, who are more consistent cannabis users. It makes me feel, pretty lazy and couch locked. And I've tried various cultivars over the years, and all have had pretty much the same. Partake, but I'm not a heavy user for that reason. So when I say my favorite cultivar, it was probably one from Gold Leaf Gardens years ago that I don't think they ever really commercially produced, or didn't for very long. It was called Kava, and it was like a Charlotte's Web kind of 1-to-1 CBD to THC or higher ratio, so very low THC. I'm a lightweight, and that was kind of where I landed on that. So
cool.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a great answer, because I feel like like my mom, she can't smoke a THC heavy strain. She can only have something with CBD. And when it's CBD, she's like giggly and laughs and, kind of has like a fun time. Like she's like, I just feel like partying or whatever. And I'm like, but then THC, she's like in a corner rocking back and forth, almost having a panic attack. And so, everyone's endocannabinoid system is different. And I totally get that, if your goal during the day is to be productive and it doesn't make you productive, then, I've heard some people say they just can only have it at night, like before bed, just to help them get a really restful night's sleep. Or if it was a stressful day, or if they have aches and pains from the day or something like that, where like that's the only application that they can use it for, because everything else is, hey, look at Tad over there just zoning out on the couch with a bag of chips watching some esoteric show.
Yeah. I mean, there is research that shows a synergy effect, like a small amount of THC does help medically, according to a lot of the research I've seen. So I think that's interesting. Also, I have an employee that literally will wake up, brush his teeth, and smoke a joint, and he is very lucid and functional, and that works for him and his endocannabinoid system. So yeah, I would agree we're all different, and there's no judgment on my end, but I definitely have had some people throw some heat my way because they say I'm not a big user and I can't understand the plant without, consuming it a lot. So it is what it is.
For sure. I think that that's an unfortunate viewpoint because it's like you don't necessarily need to eat all the tomatoes that you produce to be a great tomato farmer, right? Like, you taste them.
Sure.
Sure. But, if you're like, also, like, I work in a commercial space, and if people are coming in stoned, I'm like, you're not getting the work done that we're going to need to be able to achieve today at, like you've seen within the industry, like there's a lot of cases where more is trying to be done with less. And in a lot of those cases, focus is extremely key. And I don't know too many. I mean, like, yes, there are definitely some highly functioning stoners out there, but there's a lot of also stoners that sort of get that tunnel vision and not necessarily are the most productive when nice and stoned. And I think that that's fine.
Yeah. I would add too, I have really bad allergies. So like my sense of smell is very, very poor. It has to be pretty strong for me even to smell it, to be honest. And so
Sure.
I don't get those nuances, unfortunately, that a lot of people do. But I will say probably the favorite cultivar that I've grown recently that everyone, all my friends' family really liked was Oishi. I think it's by Archive.
Yeah.
That was a big hit compared to some of the other ones I've grown recently. So
Did you grow that out from seed, or did you get a already hunted cut of that?
I got a cut from a buddy. I think he did grow it from seed originally, so it would have been a pheno. But yeah. Cool.
Yeah, we did a pheno hunt of Oishi, and we still have two different cuts, our 18 and our 22, that we run for outdoor every year. And it is just such a fun flavor. It's like somewhat berry, but you also have this sort of savory, almost like potpourri to it that is it's like very, very floral and very pungent. So I could see how, I have terrible allergies as well. And so I really only gravitate towards the things that I can smell without having to crush them up and shove them in my nose. I want to smell it when I enter the room.
Yeah, for sure.
So, I mean, with that being Oishi, and then the critical, I think, is that what you said, or Kava? Yeah, for sure. Do you happen to have a favorite breeder that you gravitate towards if you are, and when you are growing at home?
No, I don't think that like I said, being that I'm not a connoisseur in a lot of ways, I don't think it would be fair to say that. I've heard wonderful things about Archive through my friends that are much more discerning. And then I work with Chad Westport, we went to school together growing up. Love that guy.
Cool.
And everyone that I know loves his No Joke and other cultivars. I know he's not a huge breeder, but I think he's a really great guy. And then I have an employee, Brandon Hudson, that does some breeding as well. And so that's primarily where I'm getting my genetics, is from Brandon or Chad these days. But
cool.
There's so many great breeders out there. It's really hard to say.
It is.
Crockett Farms is another one. I really like those guys, so I will give them a shout out too.
I'm sorry, say their name one more time.
Oh, Crockett Farms.
Crockett, cool.
Yeah, they do. Yeah,
definitely.
Good stuff too.
I feel like there's 100 new breeders every day almost, and so it is really hard to parse through it all. And then the guys that are the really big names within the breeding world tend to stay up there. And so sometimes I feel like it's almost like the beer industry, right? Like you have like 4 big names that everyone knows, and then a million others that only the people that are local to them or have a cult following are going to know about. But it is a tough question. Sometimes I'll caveat it with, especially when I interview breeders, I'll ask them, if you had to restart your entire breeding project, what breeder would you have to start your breeding project with, their source material? But yeah, great answer. I think that for someone that is, growing for fun and for their own education, basically, go with what you have locally and search through it, because there's also just so many different phenotypes that you can find that something's going to work for you.
Yeah.
All right, last sort of wrap-up question here. What is your most memorable smoking or cannabis-related experience?
Ooh, good question. I think probably the most memorable would have been the first time I tried it because I was so nervous. I went out on a hike in the woods all by myself, went off the trail, took a tiny hit because I was nervous just to see how it would affect me and then make sure I didn't have to drive anywhere for a while. That was probably the most positive, memorable ones. I could definitely tell you some negative edible experiences that everyone's had over the years of getting too high. And definitely some funny stories of buddies and things. But yeah, that was probably the just the clarity and focus that cannabis gave me, in that moment. The first trying it, I thought was pretty cool.
Since you were older, and I know that a lot of people will say they just didn't, they didn't experience cannabis the first time that they tried it. They didn't have they didn't get really high, or they didn't have that euphoric experience or whatever it is. Do you remember that first experience being something where you felt like an actual, a mind change or a body change from it?
Maybe a little bit. I think I took a pretty small hit. I think for me, it was more of a shift in my attitude towards something, going against, the rules. Sure. Being someone who was kind of straight edge. So for me, it was more like trying something new, getting out into a new perspective on how I viewed what was okay for myself and my body. I think that was probably the bigger shift there. But I remember feeling a sense of calmness and hey, this is okay. And since then, I know I do feel that sense of focus and hyper clarity that cannabis brings, I think is really unique, consciousness experience. And I think that's pretty cool.
Awesome. Well, Tad, this has been a wonderful conversation. I feel like we've dove into a lot of different topics that for people that are growing at home or even in the commercial space that are using an organic substrate, I feel like there's a lot of information in this episode that people are going to be able to draw from and even follow up with more questions to you about. So, any of the listeners, if you do have more questions, please, like Tad said, reach out to him on Instagram. You can find him at, I think, at KiS Organics on Instagram and the KiS Organics website. He's all over the place and doing shows with Chad Westport all the time, the questions and answers. So reach out and find out more if you do have questions. But again, Tad, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been great, and I really think that the listeners are going to like this one.
Thank you, man. I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. All right. We'll talk soon.